Hello, this is Professor Teresa Pelkie. This is Session 2, Part 3, NULL and How It Is Used. One of the problems that occurs when you work with data is that sometimes you won't have a value for a data element. For example, this slide shows some data elements that might be included in a table of persons and addresses. The idea is that the table contains a person's first and last names, their addresses, and the date they moved into that address and the date they moved out. On the right side of the example, you see some of the possible problems with some of the data elements. For example, you might not know the person's first name. In some cultures, a person is not identified by a first and last name, but by only one name. For address information, there might not be an address line 2. For the move-in, move-out dates, you might not know one or both of the dates. If the person is still living at the address, there is no move-out date. The issue is, given a table that includes the data elements shown here, how should the missing or unknown values be stored in the database? It turns out that there are two common solutions to the missing data problem. The first solution is to assign a default value to a data element whose value is not known. For example, if a name or address element value is not known, a default value of an empty string can be assigned to character or variable character data. An empty string is coded as two single quote characters right next to each other. It is sometimes called a zero-length string. If you put a single quote, then a space, then another single quote, you have a string with a length of 1, which is the one blank space. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference between an empty string and a blank string when the value is displayed on your screen, but there is a difference in the actual value that is in the column. For the date values, if either date is not known, the null value can be assigned to the date. Null is an SQL reserved word or keyword that means the value for a column is not known. By not known, we mean that the value is not known when the row is inserted into the database. Going back to the previous example of the name and address data, if you don't know the move-out date when you insert the name and address data into the table, you can assign the null value for the move-out date using the SQL insert statement. Null is defined on a column-by-column basis for each column in a table. If a column can contain the null value, the column is said to be null capable. You need to understand that null is a special keyword. If you have a character field and you enter the letters NULL as the value, that is not the same as assigning the null value to the column. All you've done in that case is enter a 4-letter value that spells out the SQL keyword. For most character and variable character columns, you can assign the empty string instead of the null value. Null is more commonly used with date, numeric, and bit data types, where there is no easy alternative to represent the lack of a value. For example, let's say that you have a date column that is not null capable, but you don't know what value should be assigned to the date when you insert the data into the table. If you don't assign a valid date, SQL will not allow the insert statement. In situations like that, you'll sometimes see that the date value that was assigned was January 1st, 1970, which is a historic artifact from the Unix operating system. For a numeric data type column that is not null, the usual default value that is assigned is 0. It is usually okay to assign 0 as the default value, but you'll see on the next slide that there could be an issue with this. Bit values are either true or false, represented as 1 or 0. In some cases, you might decide that a default of true or a default of false can be used. But many times you'll need to define a bit data type column as null capable to let you specify that you do not know the value. In some cases, there is a difference in whether or not you assign a default value or null. Here is a problem. You have a table that contains a list of items and a quantity. You want to find out the average quantity. Now the question is, do you want to find the average based on the number of items, or do you want the average based upon only those items that had a quantity? The list item on the left shows how the average would be computed if the quantity has a default value of 0. In this case, the average is computed by adding 5 plus 10 plus 0 plus 9, giving a total of 24. You divide 24 by 4, which is the number of items, giving an average of 6. The item list on the right shows how the average is calculated when null is used for an item that has an unknown quantity. In this case, the sum of 24 is the same, but the number of items that are counted is only 3, so the average on the right is 8. Either list, the left or the right, might be correct. It depends on how you need to use the data. So you can see that there is no hard and fast rule that says that a numeric column should always be null capable, or it should always have a default value of 0. On this slide, you see the column definitions for the city table that is in the World Database using the MySQL workbench. Going from left to right, you first see the column names. Next, you see the data types assigned to the columns. After data type, there is a section with a lot of checkboxes. The checkboxes are used to set column attributes. The only attribute we are looking at now is the NN attribute. That stands for not null. When the checkbox is checked, it means that a null value cannot be assigned to the column. If the NN column does not have a check mark, the column is null capable. Following the checkboxes on the far right, you see the default expression column, where a default value for a column is specified. Usually, when the not null checkbox is checked, you will have a default value. That means when a row of data is inserted into the table, the default value will be assigned to the column if you do not supply a value for the column. You can see that there is no default value for the ID column, the first column, even though that column has the not null check mark. The reason why there is no default is because there are two other checkboxes that are checked for the ID column, PK and AI. PK stands for primary key, and AI stands for auto increment. You'll learn more about these column attributes in the next video in this session. Here you see the create table statement that can be used to create the city table. You saw this statement in the previous video where we reviewed column names and we also talked about the tick marks. You can see that each of the columns includes the not null keywords. Those keywords mean that none of the columns in this table can have the null value assigned to them. You can also see that the name, country code, district, and population columns have the default keyword followed by the default value. The ID column includes the auto increment keyword, and the primary key keywords are used to indicate that ID is the primary key column. When you create a new table, you can use either the workbench that you saw on the previous slide, or you can type in a create table statement. The workbench helps you get started with the create table statement, so you don't need to type in the entire statement. That's all for now. You'll be seeing more about null later in this course. In the next video, we'll become familiar with one of the foundational features of a relational database, primary keys.